The very scenario that fell apart in Canada due to conditions was unfolding smoothly on the other side of the world at the same time. And they even delivered the actual hardware before the paperwork was fully finished. Now let's head to the first scene, Peru. Did these tanks suddenly cross the ocean without any prior agreement? Absolutely not. You have to understand the background to see why this scene is so special. It all began on December 9, 2025, in Lima, the capital of Peru. Hyundai Rotem sat down with the Peruvian Army and FAME, the state-owned defense company, to sign a comprehensive agreement. The broad terms of the agreement were as follows: to supply Peru with a total of 195 units, including 54 K2 tanks and 141 K800 armored vehicles. It was a significant modernization of their ground forces, replacing tanks and armored vehicles all at once. The scale is estimated at around 3 trillion won, but please take this figure with a grain of salt. Neither the Peruvian government nor our companies have ever officially disclosed the exact amount. It is merely an estimate based on the unit prices of exports to Poland. But the real core of this contract wasn't the number on the price tag. What Peru really wanted was to know how to build them. The contract is structured in 2 stages. First, from 2026 to 2028, they buy finished products to meet immediate needs, and then from 2029 to 2040, they will build a plant in Lima to manufacture K2s locally. Initial investment for building the factory alone is about $270 million. That 380 billion won, and it was agreed that 30% of the armored vehicle parts will be supplied directly by Peruvian companies. For Peru, this wasn't just about buying weapons, it was a 15-year project to become a nation that manufactures its own weapons. In fact, the commander of the Peruvian Armed Forces said exactly this: that just as South Korea learned technology from the US in the past to build its own tanks, Peru intends to follow that same path. And this is the real point of today's story. The comprehensive agreement I just mentioned is a framework agreement. The detailed execution contracts to be added on top are expected to be finalized within 2026. In other words, the paperwork process to finalize all the guarantees is still ongoing. But before that final documentation was even completed, the actual tanks for the demonstration and parade had already arrived at the port of Callao. Usually the cargo only starts to move cautiously once all the paperwork is wrapped up. However, this time, the order of events was completely reversed. In early July, a car carrier flying the Korean flag docked at the pier of the port of Callao. The ship's name was Glovis Safety. A massive ramp lowered slowly, and what emerged were K2 tanks and K808 Baeco armored vehicles painted in desert colors. Instead of the familiar green camouflage, they were dressed in new attire tailored for Peru's arid deserts and coastal regions. The fact that a ship usually carrying finished cars crossed the Pacific with tanks and armored vehicles speaks volumes about how far the reach of Korea's defense industry has grown. Local media outlets were immediately abuzz with the news. Most expected only armored vehicles to arrive, but when the doors opened, the K2 main battle tank had landed as well. This was the first time a K-tank had officially appeared on a public stage in a Latin American country. These units crossed the Pacific at this time for 2 main reasons. One was to be displayed in the Grand Military Parade for Peru's Independence Day on July 28, and the other was for local performance testing. It meant they would verify the specs requested by the Peruvian Army not just as numbers on paper, but in the actual soil and heat of Peru. The seller is confidently proving their product with the hardware before final contracts, and the buyer is verifying it personally before signing. It was a scenario where sending the actual equipment first benefited both sides. But there is another point in Peru's plan that is truly worth noting. Peru is not just overhauling its army, but its navy as well. Here, one more name comes into play: the Peruvian naval shipyard Sima. In English, it is spelled S-I-M-A. Peruvian media covers the fact that Sima is building landing ships and frigates domestically with great pride. And they point out that the technology transfer from HD Hyundai Heavy Industries is linked to this. It's a strategy not just of buying finished ships, but of building up Peru's own capacity to construct them. With an assembly plant for the Army in Lima and SEMA building ships for the Navy, a future is being drawn where tanks, armored vehicles, landing ships, and frigates are assembled and maintained on Peruvian soil by Peruvian hands. For Peru, this means that money for weapons doesn't just flow outward, but part of it returns as local jobs, with technology steadily accumulating in their factories and shipyards. Furthermore, Peruvian media is particularly focused on the calculation that Lima's assembly plant could serve not just Peru, but as a supply hub for all of Latin America. It is a vision where assembled and serviced equipment is later exported to neighboring countries. Then, Peru's position would shift from a country that only buys weapons to one that supplies them to the region. It is the very same concept that Canada missed out on due to its conditions. In essence, Peru is actively pursuing the transition from an importer to a producer by its own choice. However, the most notable part of this story is that the criticism toward Canada is coming from within, not from the outside. Regarding the decision to hand the submarine contract to Germany, voices of self-reflection are emerging from inside Canada itself. First, there are Canada's defense journals and experts. They argue that the submarine project and ground-based weaponry should be viewed separately. They believe that regardless of where the submarines are purchased, it would be more beneficial for the Canadian Army to order the K9 howitzers and K10 ammunition resupply vehicles right now